Hello everyone, welcome to our YouTube channel. My name is Sachin. In this video, we are going to discuss about the services. So, without wasting any much time, let's start. So, what is a service in Kubernetes? So, let's suppose you have an application, a pod running in your cluster, and you want to expose it to the outside world, and also you want the pod to communicate internally within the cluster. So, how will you do that? So for that, services are used. Service is responsible for enabling network access to the pods. You need to have a manifest file to create a service, and there you will provide all the details about it, and what kind of service you are providing, and which pod it should attach to. So those details you will provide in the manifest file, which is a YAML file, and it plays a very crucial role in enabling inter-pod communication, load balancing, and providing a stable network endpoint for accessing the application. Okay, so these are the type of services: cluster IP, Nodeport, load balancer, and ingress. So ingress is a very vast topic, so we will just get an overview of it, and we'll discuss the most of it in the next video. So the first thing is cluster IP. A cluster IP services provides a stable internet IP address and DNS name for accessing the pods within the cluster. So it it is basically used for internal pod to pod communication within the cluster. So using a cluster IP, you cannot expose the pod to the outside world. But yes, if you want to if you want to have a connection of the pods internally in the cluster, you will be using cluster IP type of service for that. So let's understand it with an example. So let's suppose you have a front end application, and you have a backend application which is a database. So now you want to log all the things from the front end application to the database. So how that communication will happen? So for that, you will be using cluster IP service in order to establish the connection between the front end and the database pod. Okay. So this supports this is good for internal only application, and that support other workloads within the cluster. Nodeport Nodeport service exposes the pods on a specific port on each worker node, not to the master node, but each worker node in the cluster. So using this type of service, you can expose your application to the outside world, but there are various limitation onto the Nodeport. So basically, we use Nodeport services for the testing purpose only, but we don't use uh, in the live environment, in the production environment. Okay, so so you can, using Nodeport, you can expose your Kubernetes service externally to the cluster. And when you create a Nodeport service in the cluster, the API server allocates the random port number on each node, and using that port number only, you will be having access to the uh, you will be exposing it to the outside world. So any traffic that is sent to that port on a node, it will forward to the corresponding service port in the cluster. Okay, so basically it works on the port part, and also the range of the port is also limited. So because of that, we actually don't use node port service that much in the production cluster. The third one is a load balancer, which is widely used. We will use load balancer um, it as a service in a cluster, and that is also used to expose your application to the outside world. So it has so AKS load balancer can be of two type. One is external, and another one is internal. What is the difference? So external services allows inbound internet traffic to access the service. Okay, and internal AKS load balancer will allow VNet originating traffic. Only the traffic which is coming from the VNet, that that traffic only it will entertain if you are using internal AKS load balancer. Now, how will you define which load balancer to use? So in the YAML file only, in the manifest file only, you will be specifying that which load balancer you will use. By default, if you are not providing any type of load balancer, then external load balancer is used. Okay. So and also when you create an AKS cluster, by default it creates an external Azure load balancer with a single public IP address. So if you remember in the first video only, we in the second video when we created the AKS cluster, we saw the infrastructure resource group, the internal resource group of the AKS cluster, and there only the load balancer was present. Let's understand the flow of it. So so a user, so this is the external user. If it tries to access any of the pod inside the cluster, it will go to the through the Azure load balancer. Azure load balancer will take that request and it will route the traffic to the Kubernetes services, and from there in the Kubernetes services we have control plane, um, which manages all the cluster activities. So through that it will go to the uh, different pods, to the set of pods, to whichever pod you want to access, it will go to that pod. Okay. So the internet represents the external client accessing your application. The load balancer acts as an entry point and distributes the incoming traffic to the AKS cluster. The AKS cluster hosts the control plane, as we know, and through their logical, uh, through the Kubernetes services, it defines a logical group of pods and exposes them internally within the cluster. So through the Kubernetes services, it will distribute to the different pods. And pod instances are the individual running instances of your application. So they are the actual applications. Okay. So now this ingress, so just to get an overview of it. So as the name suggests, ingress is an internal uh, it is for the incoming traffic. So it is an API object that provides a way to externally expose the HTTP and HTTPS services inside the cluster. So it acts as an entry point for the traffic, and also it allows you to define the routing rules based on the host name paths or header values, whatever you provide. For that also we write a YAML file and provide all the information over there. So so in the ingress we have basically two major components. One is ingress controller and another one is ingress resource. So ingress controller, it is responsible for managing and processing the ingress resource. So first you will create the ingress controller, and from there it will go to the ingress resource. So what kind of ingress controller we have? We have Nginx, Traffic, and Azure Application Gateway ingress controller. Now we are dealing with AKS, which is Azure Kubernetes Services. So in our demo, we will be using, sorry, in our demo, we will be using Azure Application Gateway ingress controller. Okay. And then what is ingress resource? It basically defines the it specifies these routing rules. So first ingress controller will get created. From the ingress controller the traffic will go to the ingress resource, and then ingress resource we will define the routing rules, and from the routing rules it will go to the destination applications. Okay. So hope you got the overview of the services of the Azure Kubernetes services. In the upcoming video we will go to the demo part, and we will show you first the load balancer, and we will try to attach that load balancer to the pod, and then we will use the ingress. We will know more about ingress, how we can use the application gateway ingress controller into the cluster. So that's it for today's video. Hope you liked it, and thanks for your time.